Hello everybody, cheers. Hope you're having a good day. A little bit different this one. Now some of you would have seen this as a earlier video, a time-lapse video, but it's also going to be on my michaeljamessmith.tv website, where there's going to be a full lesson from start to finish. I can't remember exactly how many hours it is, but it's a lot of hours, and you get to paint along with me right from the very beginning to the very end. There's no time lapse, no content missing whatsoever. You get to see the whole process. So go and check that out now. In fact, you can check on or click on this link here and that will take you to the website. Also, there's a free lesson on there as well. So if you do want to give it a go before you pay, check that out. This picture is fairly detailed, slightly different from what I'm used to. And actually getting these leaves is, or can be, a little bit of a challenge. I'm going to go into that in a little bit in this video, but also check out my Instagram. You'll be able to see loads of behind the scenes photographs and you get to see upcoming paintings. Let's get going on this lesson now. So this area here, we're going to have to almost re-block it in again. It's had that initial block in, but we need to start adding some details, and in particular some of the darker areas. Now this is the rigger brush. This is the size series 1, size 0, and at the moment I'm not looking to get any real sharp details in the painting, just trying to get the more dense areas of the photograph kind of blocked in again. Now I'm just going to mix up a dark olivey green just to start on these fronds here. Thinned it down a little. So I need to decide at this point exactly where I'm going to start. Now I want to start at the top here, but it's a case of finding that precise point where that frond is the highest point there. Now continuing with the rigger brush here, as we start working on the details, I'm having to thin the paint down a little. That's going to give us a much sharper line, and we want to use just the very, very tip of the brush in order to get those lines as skinny as possible. So as you've seen here, I've just added a little bit of thinner. I think in a way it's a case of trial and error, trying to get that right consistency. Now I often say when working on these thinner lines that I like the consistency of the paint to be more like ink. If it's too dry, too thick, you're going to get more of a broken line. It's going to be very difficult to get a nice, skinny, sharp line. But of course there's a trade-off, because the thinner the paint, the more diluted it is, and the less strength we're going to have when we put the brush mark on the panel. And in particular, when you're painting dark over light, or the other way around, light over dark, it's very difficult to get the strength. Now, typically, when I'm painting a palm tree, I like to paint that spine first of all. So I find the furthest tip of the frond, and then I'll paint the spine in like that, and then the leaflets I paint next, and they go from the spine outwards. That way you get to work out exactly where everything needs to be. So now I'm going to start building up the density of the leaflets along this area of spine here. And I'll get that main body of the frond in first, and then we'll go and add the details afterwards. So now we have that area almost reblocked in again over that blue sky. I now am at a stage where I need to start adding those really fine details. And you have to be careful with this. You have to make sure that we're getting everything in pretty much the right place. The brush marks need to be the right length. They also need to be the right width. So it's always wise to steady your hand if you can on something, and in this instance I'm just resting my knuckle, the knuckle of my little finger on the panel, and that's allowing me to get a nice steady line. And I have to say, quite often that dictates the direction with which I paint. So I always start from back to front in the painting, but at the same time I will favour the top left area of the painting, and then I like to move, if I can, from that direction down to the bottom right, and that's so that I'm not resting my hand on any wet paint. So at this point I'm starting to now add the lighter tones. And because, once again, we are painting with contrast here, so I'm painting a lighter colour over a darker colour, it's more helpful to use a slightly thicker paint. And once again, as we suggested before, that there is a trade-off. The spine of the frond doesn't have to be quite so accurate or quite so thin, so this works okay. So I'm not thinning the paint down anywhere near as much on these lighter tones. The technique is very much the same, but I'm just generally putting more on the panel. So I'm going to start lightening up now. I like to do things in layers, so once I've picked a colour I like to try and exhaust that colour, and then afterwards I then think of the next layer to be a slightly different colour. In this case it's a bit lighter, and I'll continue until I exhaust that colour, and then we'll move over to a lighter colour yet again. So this is a really good example of how I build up the frond itself. As you can see, some of it is more dense than others, but we always have that shape where the leaflets are growing out obviously from the spine, but we have that same shape with all of the leaves. Okay, so now I'm going to add some of those lighter areas that we were discussing before. As I said, I'm not thinning this down anywhere near as much, so the consistency here I would say is more like soft butter, and you may need, in order to still get those fine lines, you may need to almost thin your brush down a little bit, and I'll show you what I mean by that now. So here we have the rigger brush. This is the Series 1 size 1. Now what we want to do is thin this down to the point that we can get a nice fine line. You can do this with obviously any brush. It works better obviously if it's a round brush, but I'll show you exactly what I do. Now I use a craft knife, and all I'm going to do is just trim down the amount of hair on the actual brush. Now, if you're feeling a little bit nervous about doing this to a new brush, then by all means do it to an old brush. It will work just as well. Now what we're going to do is roll the brush along the surface as I run the blade along the base of the hair there. And I even do a slight sawing motion and continue to roll it. So I'm rolling it away from me and continuing to saw. Very gentle. And what that starts to do is it strips away some of the hair, as you can just about see. Continue going all the way round, and then you can pull away some of the hairs. Now, if you want it skinnier still, continue doing the same thing. So I'm just gently sawing and rolling the brush along the palette. Being very gentle. Now obviously if you push too hard, I'm going to cut far more off than I want, so it's best to be gentle to begin with. Pulling off the loose hairs. Now the reason you're rolling it is so that you can get an even cut. If you just cut from one side and then turn it and cut from the other side, it's not going to be even. So the more you do it, obviously, the thinner your brush is going to become. And you can continue for as long as you want. I'm going to take it down a little bit more. A little bit more again. Being more and more gentle, the thinner we get. So there we have a skinnier brush, and it'll work just as well for anything actually, branches and twigs, but there. That's comparing it to a new brush of the same size. Now that is going to make it a lot easier to get a nice straight line. So give that a try and see how you get on. So back to the painting and adding those lighter areas now, and you can really see how adding these bright points where we have the sun just catching those fronds, it really does add to the depth. And using that skinny brush, the adjusted rigger, we're going to continue adding the lighter tones until we get that leaf looking really realistic.